It was a strange place to be. Trevor had known from the moment he first saw the house on the hill. It wasn't just the heavy, oppressive air or the crooked windows that gave it away. It was the gnomes. Gnomes weren't just decorations. They weren't just those little ceramic figures you saw in gardens, placed in quaint poses with their tiny hats and beady eyes. These were different. Larger, unsettlingly lifelike, they watched you. They watched everything, even when they were perfectly still. When Trevor's boss had told him about the house and the job, caretaking for an elderly woman in exchange for room and board for a week, he hadn't thought much of it. "What's the catch?" he had asked. "Oh, nothing much," his boss replied with a sly grin. "Just keep an eye on the place. Make sure nothing happens to the house. Oh, and don't disturb the gnomes." He didn't think much of it. Gnomes were harmless, right? What could they possibly do? It didn't take long before Trevor realized that the old woman wasn't just eccentric, she was terrified. Her wrinkled hands trembled as she handed him the keys. She warned him to lock the doors and windows at night. She stressed that he mustn't touch the gnomes. She said she would explain everything once she returned. But something in her voice, fear, desperation, made Trevor uneasy. He didn't ask too many questions. The house was old, and everything about it felt forgotten, as though time had abandoned it years ago. The dark wood floors creaked under his weight as he wandered through the rooms, the air thick with the scent of dust and something else, something foul. The gnomes were scattered across the garden and the house, perched on shelves, in the corners of rooms, their little stone eyes following his every movement. Even when he tried to ignore them, they were there, staring at him. It wasn't just the gaze that unnerved him, it was their stillness. They never moved, never twitched, never blinked. They were like lifelike statues, almost too real. Trevor tried to brush it off as overactive imagination. He had just arrived, and the isolation of the house was getting to him. There were other things to focus on, like checking the place for leaks or broken pipes, all the while keeping the house secure. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Night fell quickly, the long shadows in the house twisting and stretching across the floor. As he settled into the living room, trying to relax, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. He stood still, straining his ears, trying to pinpoint the source. There was nothing. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, as though someone or something was walking around the house. Trevor's heart began to race. He grabbed a flashlight from the table, his palms sweating, and cautiously made his way up the stairs. The house creaked with every step he took, the air growing heavier as he ascended. He reached the landing and looked down the hallway, his flashlight beam trembling in his hands. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. Trevor waited, straining to hear, but all that came was silence. And then, a faint whisper. A soft voice, so quiet he almost missed it, calling his name. Trevor. Trevor. He spun around, shining the light down the hall, but there was no one there. The voice, though, it was unmistakable. He knew it wasn't his imagination. He could feel it, deep in his gut, this was real. Something in this house was watching him. Something had been watching him since he arrived. Frozen with fear, Trevor stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what was happening. He glanced back at the stairs. Everything seemed still again. No more whispers. No more footsteps. Then, just as he was about to turn away, his flashlight flickered and dimmed. It happened too quickly for him to react, the beam sputtering and going out completely. He cursed under his breath, fumbling with the batteries, trying to make the light work. But the darkness was suffocating. He heard another sound. A soft scraping noise, almost like something was being dragged across the floor. He turned back toward the staircase, his body rigid, knowing full well that the gnomes would be waiting. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he saw one of them move. It wasn't much, just a small shift, a twitch of its stone foot. But it was enough to send a wave of dread through him. That's when he realized the gnomes weren't just decorations. They weren't just watching. They were moving. Trevor couldn't process it. His mind raced. He ran to the window and tried to open it, but the lock was stuck. The gnomes, their stony faces peering through the window, seemed to grow closer. Their eyes gleamed with something darker. With every flicker of the flashlight, the gnomes seemed to shift position, always just a little closer to the house, always watching him with cold, lifeless eyes. He backed away from the window, his hands trembling. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around him. The gnomes had crossed a line. What had once been an eerie coincidence now felt like a warning. Trevor's first instinct was to leave, but as he made his way to the door, something stopped him. The tapping. The sound was back, the slow, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking. But it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from behind him. Spinning around, Trevor's flashlight landed on a new figure. One of the gnomes had stepped off its pedestal, and now it was slowly advancing toward him, holding a strange, jagged object in its tiny hands. The object was glowing faintly in the dim light, and Trevor's blood ran cold as he realized it was a knife. The stone figure of the gnome, its face, once smooth and lifeless, was now contorted into a grotesque grin. The same figure that had been a decoration now moved with purpose, its steps deliberate, slow, and eerie. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The terror was too much, and his body locked up in place. He stumbled back, nearly falling over, but the gnome was already upon him, its tiny hand reaching for his throat, cold and unyielding. "Don't disturb the gnomes," the old woman's voice echoed in his mind, a warning too late to save him. The gnome's grip tightened, and Trevor's world turned dark. But the darkness didn't swallow him whole. Instead, it shifted. It twisted and warped, and Trevor's eyes slowly opened. He was no longer in the same room. He was in the garden, standing in front of the gnome statues. But the statues weren't statues anymore. They were alive. Each of them. Every single one. Their eyes glowed now, and their faces, those stone faces, twisted and warped as they looked at him with hunger in their eyes. The ground beneath them was disturbed, like something, or someone, had been buried there. The gnomes didn't need to speak. Their presence alone said everything. Trevor's heart hammered in his chest, the blood draining from his face. He turned to run, but the gnome's stone hands reached for him, dragging him back. The house was not just a house. It was a prison. And he was the prey. As the gnomes closed in, Trevor realized the truth. He had disturbed them. He had crossed a line. And now, there was no escaping. The last thing Trevor saw before the darkness swallowed him was the smile of the gnome with the knife, its jagged grin stretching impossibly wide, its eyes gleaming with malice.